keep her here forever.
They find her whenever.
Abby Sadler.
Alan Grant.
The extinction of our species. Son of the devil.
Deep in the middle of the ocean, a group of fishermen is carrying out what seems like another ordinary day at sea. Without any warning, the calm water erupts as a colossal mosasaurus launches out from beneath the surface. The massive prehistoric predator crashes into the fishing boat, tearing it apart before swallowing it whole in one devastating strike. The surviving crew members are thrown into the sea, desperately trying to stay alive as the enormous creature slips back beneath the waves and disappears into the darkness. For years have gone by since the volcanic eruption that destroyed Isla Nublar, yet the world still struggles to adapt to life with dinosaurs living freely among humans. Across different countries, encounters between people and these ancient creatures have become increasingly common, creating fear, uncertainty, and constant conflict. Hoping to position itself at the center of dinosaur research, Biosyngenetics, led by Louis Dodgson, has built a vast wildlife preserve hidden within the remote Dolomite Mountains of Italy. Although the sanctuary is presented as a scientific breakthrough, the corporation remains under intense public scrutiny. Persistent rumors claim that Biosyn scientists were involved in creating a cloned human girl, a mystery that has fueled global speculation. After the fall of Jurassic World, the girl disappeared, triggering an international search that continues years later. Her name is Maisie Lockwood, and her DNA is an exact genetic match to Charlotte Lockwood, the late daughter of Benjamin Lockwood, one of the original visionaries behind Jurassic Park. Meanwhile, Claire Dearing has completely changed her mission. Instead of operating a dinosaur park, she now dedicates herself to protecting these animals from illegal capture and exploitation. Alongside her trusted teammate, she sneaks into a concealed breeding operation where dinosaurs are confined in harsh and inhumane conditions. The pair secretly records everything inside, collecting valuable evidence against the traffickers running the operation. While searching through the facility, they come across a young triceratops that has been isolated from the rest of the animals. After examining it, Zia determines that the dinosaur is gravely ill and unlikely to survive much longer without immediate treatment. Claire realizes that waiting for authorities to respond would take far too long, and the animal simply doesn't have that kind of time. Refusing to leave it behind, Claire decides to rescue the triceratops herself. The team hauls its enclosure outside and calls Franklin to help with the extraction. Working together, they carefully lift the exhausted dinosaur into a waiting van. Just as they prepare to leave, the smugglers discover what is happening and rush to intercept them. Claire quickly gets behind the steering wheel, slams on the accelerator, and races away before they can be stopped. The smugglers refuse to give up and immediately send 2 pickup trucks after the fleeing rescue team. As the pursuit intensifies, Claire notices a large herd of triceratops ahead and steers the van straight toward them. Her risky maneuver works exactly as she hoped. Startled by the approaching vehicles, the enormous dinosaurs scatter across the path, blocking the smugglers and wrecking their pursuit. With the road behind them in chaos, Claire and the others manage to get away with the rescued juvenile dinosaur. Elsewhere, high in the mountains of Nevada, Owen Grady is working to relocate a herd of Parasaurolophus to a protected habitat. During the transfer, one nervous dinosaur breaks away from the group and heads in the wrong direction. Owen reacts quickly, expertly throwing a rope around the animal before fastening it to a nearby tree. Instead of overpowering the frightened creature, he remains calm and patiently gains its confidence. Once it settles down, Owen gently leads it back to join the rest of the herd. At the same time, Maisie Lockwood continues living in isolation, hidden away in the remote mountains because governments and powerful organizations are still searching for her. Although staying out of sight has become part of her daily life, she frequently slips away on her bicycle to explore nearby towns, ignoring the dangers of being recognized. After the passing of her grandfather, Claire became Maisie's legal guardian and has devoted herself to keeping the girl safe. Convinced that remaining hidden is the only way to protect her from those who want to capture her, Claire keeps their location a closely guarded secret. Maisie, however, finds the constant isolation difficult to accept. Curious about the world beyond the mountains, she grows increasingly frustrated with the limits placed on her freedom and longs for a normal life. Maisie continues to struggle with the truth about who she is. Knowing that she was created as a clone often leaves her questioning her own identity, making her wonder whether she is simply living in someone else's shadow. Claire reminds her that a person's value is not determined by the way they were born. Regardless of her genetic origin, Maisie is her own individual, with a life and future that belong only to her. Not long afterward, Owen returns to the cabin after finishing his work for the day. Once he arrives, Claire tells him that Maisie slipped away to the nearby town again without telling anyone. Together they recognize a difficult reality: they cannot keep her hidden from the world forever, no matter how hard they try. Not far from their home, Blue has established a peaceful territory of her own. The velociraptor is now raising a young hatchling named Beta, a juvenile whose DNA is an exact match to her mother's. Blue spends time teaching Beta the skills needed to survive in the wild, including how to stalk prey. Before the lesson can succeed, however, a wolf suddenly rushes in, steals the rabbit they were hunting, and disappears into the forest. As night falls, everyone gathers around a campfire, unaware that they are being watched. Nearby, a mercenary named Rain Delacourt contacts the people who hired him. He reports that he has successfully tracked Owen to the secluded cabin. His mission has uncovered not only the missing clone, Maisie Lockwood, but also Blue and her genetically identical offspring, Beta. Elsewhere, on a rural farm in Texas, 2 children are feeding and looking after their family's chickens when they notice something strange. Attached to a nearby wooden fence is an enormous insect unlike anything they have ever seen before. Within seconds, the strange discovery turns into a nightmare. Countless oversized locusts pour across the farmland in an enormous swarm, covering the sky like a dark cloud. They descend on the crops with incredible speed, stripping entire fields bare in only a matter of moments. Terrified, the 2 children race toward the nearest barn, slam the doors shut behind them, and wait inside as the relentless insects sweep over the property before finally moving on. The next day, paleobotanist Ellie Sattler arrives to examine the destruction firsthand. Surveying the ruined fields, she learns that this is far from an isolated event. More than 60 farming locations have already experienced nearly identical infestations. As she studies the evidence, one detail immediately stands out. While most of the surrounding crops have been completely consumed, a neighboring field remains perfectly intact. Determined to understand why, Ellie investigates further and uncovers a significant clue. The untouched farm grows its crops using seeds produced by biosyn. The discovery deepens her suspicions. She begins to believe the company may have intentionally engineered these giant locusts, creating an agricultural disaster that would leave farmers with no choice but to rely on biosyn's genetically engineered seed products. Intent on exposing the truth, Ellie travels to Utah to meet with someone she knows can help, Alan Grant. Now a respected paleontologist, Alan is intrigued when Ellie presents one of the enormous insects for examination. His scientific interest quickly gives way to concern as Ellie explains the possible consequences. If the insects continue breeding at their current pace, they could destroy harvests on a global scale and trigger a devastating food shortage. Certain that biosyn is connected to the outbreak, she asks Alan to join her in gathering the evidence needed to reveal the corporation's role. Back at the secluded cabin, Maisie notices Beta for the first time and slowly approaches the young velociraptor with curiosity. Before she gets too close, Blue suddenly emerges from the trees. Owen immediately tells Maisie not to move, then carefully steps forward himself, relying on the trust he has built with Blue over many years. After reassuring the protective mother, he quietly sends Maisie back toward the cabin. Still frustrated by her isolated life, Maisie ignores the warnings and leaves again on her bicycle, unaware that someone is secretly following her. Hidden nearby, Rain Delacourt keeps her under constant surveillance. As soon as she rides away, he contacts his team and reports her exact location. At nearly the same moment, another group closes in on Blue and Beta. The hunters manage to seize the young raptor despite Blue's desperate attempts to protect her offspring. During the violent struggle, Blue is knocked over the edge of a cliff and vanishes into the ravine below, leaving her fate uncertain. The kidnappers flee with Beta, while Blue's anguished cries ring through the mountains and Owen can only watch, powerless to stop them. Although Owen does everything he can, the kidnappers manage to get away with Beta before he can stop them. The young velociraptor is taken, leaving Blue heartbroken after losing her only offspring. At the same time, Maisie is cycling across a bridge, completely unaware that she is being followed. Suddenly, several abductors move into position, surrounding her from every direction and blocking any chance of escape. Before she has time to react, they force her into their vehicle and disappear. Owen sees the kidnapping from a distance but arrives too late to stop it. Realizing the captors have already fled, he races back to the cabin and tells Claire that Maisie has been taken. Overcome with anger and determination, Owen grabs his rifle, ready to track down the people responsible. Just before setting out, Blue emerges from the trees, visibly distressed after losing Beta. Looking at the grieving raptor, Owen promises that he will bring her baby home. Desperate for leads, Claire contacts Franklin and asks him to identify the kidnappers. Using his network of contacts, Franklin traces the operation to a professional hunter connected to the abduction. He also explains that undercover agents working alongside law enforcement have infiltrated the trafficking organization and may have information about Rain Delacourt's current whereabouts. Meanwhile, Ellie Sattler and Alan Grant arrive at biosyn's enormous dinosaur sanctuary, hidden deep within Italy's mountainous landscape. They are welcomed by Ramsey Cole, Lewis Dodgson's trusted communications director, who guides them through the sprawling preserve before leading them to the company's headquarters for a meeting with Dodgson himself. The biosyn CEO greets them only briefly, explaining that he has an extremely busy schedule. Leaving Ramsey to continue the tour, Dodgson quickly excuses himself. As they explore the facility, they enter a lecture hall where a familiar voice is speaking to a class of students. The lecturer is Ian Malcolm, whose expertise in chaos theory continues to attract attention years after the events of Jurassic World. Once the lecture concludes, Malcolm quietly meets with Ellie and Alan away from the crowd. While they wait for refreshments, he reveals what he has uncovered in secret. Biosyn, he believes, is directly connected to the mysterious locust outbreak. Convinced that the proof is hidden somewhere inside the complex, Malcolm discreetly slips Ellie a security keycard. He tells her that the evidence they need is stored in a highly restricted section of the facility known as Basement 6, where the giant insects are being studied. Elsewhere inside the headquarters, Dr. Henry Wu meets privately with Dodgson to discuss an increasingly dangerous situation. The genetically engineered locusts are no longer behaving as intended. Wu explains that they are evolving rapidly, reproducing at an alarming rate, and becoming far more difficult to contain than anyone anticipated. He argues that every released insect must be eliminated before the crisis grows beyond anyone's control. Dodgson refuses the proposal without hesitation. Destroying the insects now, he insists, would only invite suspicion and risk exposing Biosyn's role in creating them. More concerned with protecting the company's image than solving the disaster, he dismisses Wu's warning. To ease the scientists' concerns, Dodgson reveals that both Maisie Lockwood and Beta have been successfully captured. Wu realizes that studying their unique genetics may provide the breakthrough needed to reverse the flaw responsible for the locust catastrophe. After successfully delivering Beta to her clients, pilot Kayla Watts collects her payment and prepares to leave. Before departing, she notices a teenage girl being escorted through the compound. One look is enough for Kayla to realize the girl isn't there by choice. Although she recognizes that something is terribly wrong, she decides not to get involved. Challenging a network of armed traffickers would put her own life in immediate danger. Meanwhile, Owen and Claire arrive in Italy, where they reunite with their old ally Barry. Using his contacts, Barry leads them into the heart of the illegal dinosaur trade. Their investigation brings them to a hidden marketplace where prehistoric animals are bought, sold, and exploited for profit. Some are forced to battle each other for entertainment, while others are treated as working animals with no regard for their welfare. While searching the market, Claire crosses paths with Kayla and realizes she is an American pilot. Believing she may know something, Claire asks whether she has seen Maisie. Kayla refuses to answer, unwilling to make herself a target by helping strangers against dangerous criminals. Elsewhere, the trafficking operation is being supervised by Soyona Santos, who congratulates her team for capturing both Maisie and Beta alive. With that mission complete, attention shifts to another valuable shipment, several highly trained Atrociraptors. Unlike wild predators, these dinosaurs have been conditioned to attack anyone designated by a specialized tracking system. Just as business is underway, undercover law enforcement officers launch a coordinated raid. The marketplace erupts into confusion as buyers, smugglers, and guards scatter in every direction. Rain Delacourt and Soyona immediately attempt to escape, but Owen concentrates on pursuing Rain, convinced he can lead him to Maisie. During the chase, Rain deliberately overturns the transport carrying the Atrociraptors. The damaged cages burst open, releasing two deadly predators into the crowded streets. They immediately pursue Owen, who narrowly avoids their attacks using his experience and quick reflexes. After an exhausting pursuit, Owen finally catches Rain, and the two engage in a violent fight. Rain is eventually knocked to the ground with no chance to escape. As the Atrociraptors close in, Owen demands to know where Maisie has been taken. Terrified, Rain admits that Soyona took custody of the girl and insists he knows nothing beyond that point. Satisfied that he has learned everything Rain can tell him, Owen leaves, allowing the desperate smuggler to face the predators closing around him. At the same time, Soyona finds herself trapped by advancing officers. Without hesitation, she activates the Atrociraptor's targeting system, using a handheld laser to designate the pursuing officers as targets. The dinosaurs instantly redirect their attention, throwing the streets into panic as people flee in every direction. Amid the chaos, Claire manages to seize one of the control devices and confronts Soyona. The two struggle fiercely before Claire gains the advantage. During the confrontation, she learns that Maisie has been transported to Biosyn's sanctuary in Italy. Before she can act on the information, another Atrociraptor appears. In a final attempt to escape, Soyona aims the targeting laser directly at Claire. The predator immediately changes course and charges after her, forcing Claire into a desperate sprint through the city's narrow streets as the relentless dinosaur closes in behind her. The dinosaur charges down the staircases at terrifying speed, closing the distance with every passing second. With nowhere left to run, Claire makes a desperate leap across the gap between two buildings. It's a dangerous risk, but it saves her life. Watching the relentless pursuit unfold, Kayla finally decides to intervene. As Claire loses her footing and crashes into the back of a moving truck, Kayla quickly climbs into the driver's seat and speeds away before the dinosaur can reach them. Elsewhere, Barry finds himself cornered with only moments to spare. Just when all hope seems lost, Owen arrives to help. Working together, they outsmart the predator. Barry deliberately lures the creature toward a nearby enclosure, and at the perfect moment, Owen slams the gate shut, trapping the dinosaur inside. With the immediate danger contained, Barry officially places Soyona under arrest. Moments later, Owen receives a call from Claire. Their conversation confirms the information they've been searching for: Maisie is being held at Biosyn. Without hesitation, Owen sets out to rescue her. Unfortunately, Soyona isn't finished causing trouble. Before being taken into custody, she activates the targeting laser once again and locks it onto Owen. Instantly, two Atrociraptors begin hunting him. Meanwhile, another predator continues chasing the truck carrying Claire and Kayla. As they speed through the crowded city streets, the dinosaur repeatedly attacks the vehicle. At the last possible moment, Claire grabs a metal rod and strikes the creature, forcing it to retreat and finally ending the deadly chase. As Owen races through the chaos consuming the city, he witnesses widespread destruction. Massive dinosaurs rampage through the streets while terrified civilians scramble to escape. People flee in every direction, but not everyone is quick enough to avoid the danger. Although Owen wants to help, surviving his own relentless pursuit becomes his only option. Meanwhile, Claire and Kayla successfully reach their aircraft. Moments later, Owen arrives at the runway just as the plane begins accelerating for takeoff. At Claire's urging, Kayla opens the rear cargo ramp, giving Owen one final opportunity to board. Perfectly timing his approach, Owen launches himself toward the moving aircraft and grabs hold before it gains too much speed. One of the pursuing Atrociraptors nearly catches him, leaping into the open cargo bay and coming within inches of its target. But as the aircraft finally lifts into the sky, the dinosaur loses its footing and tumbles backward into the ocean below, dragging Owen's motorcycle down with it. With the immediate danger finally behind them, Owen, Claire, and Kayla begin their journey toward Biosyn's secluded sanctuary, hidden deep within the mountains of Italy. Back at the Biosyn facility, Ramsey Cole informs Ellie and Alan that they have only 30 minutes to investigate before meeting him at the Hyperloop train station. Elsewhere inside the complex, Dr. Henry Wu sits down with Maisie and begins explaining why she is so vital to his research. According to Wu, Blue carries genetic material derived from monitor lizards, reptiles capable of reproducing without a mate. Because of this rare biological trait, Blue and her offspring, Beta, are genetically identical. Wu explains that Maisie's story is remarkably similar. Charlotte Lockwood, Maisie's mother, accomplished something extraordinary. Like Blue, Charlotte was able to create a child using only her own DNA, making Maisie's birth a groundbreaking scientific achievement. As Maisie listens, Wu reveals truths she has never heard before. Charlotte was a brilliant geneticist who deeply admired dinosaurs and devoted much of her life to advancing genetic science. However, not long after Maisie was born, Charlotte developed a serious inherited disease that eventually claimed her life. Before she died, though, Charlotte achieved what many believed was impossible. She discovered a way to correct the genetic mutation responsible for her illness. More importantly, she successfully modified every cell in Maisie's body, ensuring that her daughter would never inherit the same condition. That remarkable breakthrough is what fascinates Wu. If he can uncover exactly how Charlotte accomplished such a complex genetic alteration, he believes he may be able to apply the same principles to solving another global crisis, the genetically engineered giant locusts devastating the world's food supply. Meanwhile, Ellie and Alan disguise themselves as Biosyn employees and secretly enter the restricted laboratory where the engineered insects are being studied. Their mission is straightforward: obtain a DNA sample. By comparing the genetic material of these locusts with those destroying crops around the world, they hope to prove that Biosyn is directly responsible for the agricultural disaster. If successful, the evidence could expose the corporation's actions and trigger a government investigation. While Wu is occupied in a meeting with Dodgson, Maisie sees the perfect opportunity to act. She quietly approaches Beta's enclosure and unlocks the cage. The young dinosaur immediately slips out and makes its escape. At the same time, Maisie seizes the chance to flee as well. Their escape instantly triggers the facility's security system, and alarms begin echoing throughout the laboratory. The piercing sound agitates the giant engineered locusts, causing them to swarm aggressively toward everyone nearby. Within moments, the laboratory descends into chaos. Maisie and Beta narrowly avoid the attacking insects and soon cross paths with Ellie and Alan. Realizing they are all working toward the same objective, the four join forces and begin escaping the facility together. Meanwhile, Claire, Owen, and Kayla are approaching Biosyn's sanctuary when disaster suddenly strikes high above the mountains. A gigantic Quetzalcoatlus launches a violent attack on their aircraft. One of the largest flying reptiles to ever exist, the enormous predator repeatedly slams into the plane, inflicting severe damage with every impact. The aircraft quickly begins losing altitude, and the situation grows increasingly desperate. It soon becomes clear that only one of the ejector seats is equipped with a parachute, Claire's. Knowing someone has to reach Maisie, Owen urges Claire to jump and continue the mission without him. With no other choice, Claire ejects from the crippled aircraft. For a brief moment, it seems she has escaped the danger. Then even more flying predators appear. They immediately descend upon her, tearing into her parachute canopy and sending her into another terrifying free fall. Fortunately, the emergency ejection seat is equipped with a backup parachute. At the last possible second, it deploys successfully, slowing her descent and allowing her to reach the ground alive. Back inside the Biosyn sanctuary, Ellie and Alan arrive at the Hyperloop train station, where they finally learn the truth about Ramsey. Despite appearances, he has secretly been working against Dodgson from the very beginning. Ramsey reveals that he has been helping them all along and assists the group in escaping with the evidence they collected. Elsewhere in the wilderness surrounding the sanctuary, Claire finds herself hanging upside down from a tree, still strapped into her ejection seat. As she struggles to free herself, a massive Therizinosaurus slowly wanders into the area. The enormous dinosaur has no idea Claire is nearby. Even more troubling, Dodgson begins to suspect that Ian Malcolm has been secretly assisting them. Determined to prevent anyone from escaping with the incriminating evidence, Dodgson immediately orders the sanctuary's transportation system shut down. Power to the Hyperloop train is cut, eliminating their planned escape route. Trapped inside the facility, Ellie, Alan, Maisie, and Beta are forced to search for another way out. Shortly afterward, Dodgson summons Ian Malcolm to his office. Their conversation is brief but tense. Having uncovered Ian's role in helping Ellie and Alan, Dodgson wastes no time and immediately terminates his employment at Biosyn. Fortunately, Ramsey remains loyal to the group. With his help, Ian quickly steals a transport vehicle and sets out to rescue his friends before Biosyn security can intercept them. Meanwhile, Alan, Ellie, Maisie, and Beta continue searching for an escape route through the sanctuary. Hoping to find an alternate tunnel, Alan climbs a nearby ladder. Instead of discovering a path to safety, he comes face to face with another terrifying dinosaur. Forced to retreat, the group continues moving through the facility. Every corridor seems to lead them into even greater danger. Before long, they encounter more predators, leaving them with no choice but to press deeper into the complex. Eventually, they reach what appears to be a dead end. Their only possible escape is a massive reinforced security gate. Desperately, they struggle to unlock it, but the security system refuses to respond. As the pursuing dinosaurs draw closer, panic begins to set in. Just then, Ian arrives. He immediately starts bypassing the security controls, rapidly trying different access codes while the predators continue closing the distance. Elsewhere in the facility, Ramsey remotely accesses the system and successfully overrides the lock. At the very last moment, the massive gate slides open, allowing everyone to escape. Elsewhere in the wilderness surrounding the sanctuary, Claire continues making her way through the dense forest. Every step is filled with danger as dinosaurs roam freely through the area. Suddenly, a Dilophosaurus emerges from the undergrowth and slowly advances toward her, preparing to attack. Before Claire can react, Owen and Kayla arrive. Working together, they drive the predator away and reunite with Claire before she is seriously harmed. At the same time, Dodgson grows increasingly desperate to erase every trace of Biosyn's involvement in the global ecological disaster. Determined to destroy the evidence, he orders all of the genetically engineered locusts to be incinerated. The containment system redirects the insects toward the facility's incineration chamber. However, the plan backfires catastrophically. As the locusts come under attack, they swarm violently and overwhelm their containment enclosure. The chamber is destroyed, releasing thousands of giant insects into the open. Moments later, the escaping swarm bursts into the surrounding forest. Many of the locusts are already engulfed in flames. As they spread across the valley, they ignite trees and vegetation wherever they fly, transforming the Biosyn sanctuary into a rapidly expanding wildfire. Meanwhile, Ian is driving the rescue vehicle when the burning swarm suddenly descends from the sky. Flaming locusts slam into the transport from every direction, blinding the driver and causing Ian to lose control. The vehicle overturns violently before finally coming to a stop. Remarkably, everyone survives the crash. Not long afterward, Owen and Claire arrive at the wreckage. They are overwhelmed with relief when they find Maisie safe, alive, and completely unharmed. The reunion is short-lived. A massive Giganotosaurus suddenly emerges nearby, forcing the group into another desperate escape. Everyone scatters in search of cover, but Ian chooses a different approach. Instead of fleeing with the others, he stays behind and hides inside the overturned transport vehicle. Before long, the rest of the group finds themselves trapped with nowhere left to run. Just when escape seems impossible, Ian steps out from hiding. Holding a long skewer with a burning locust impaled on the end, he deliberately draws the attention of the enormous predator. The Giganotosaurus immediately turns toward him. As the giant dinosaur prepares to attack, Ian throws the flaming insect directly into its open mouth. The unexpected distraction creates just enough time for everyone else to rush inside the facility. The predator, however, refuses to give up. It slams into the building with tremendous force, shattering large sections of glass as it tries to reach them. Only after Claire fires a stun device directly into its eye does the Giganotosaurus finally retreat. For the moment, the group is safe. Their next challenge is finding a way out of the sanctuary before the spreading wildfire and roaming dinosaurs make escape impossible. Just then, Ramsey arrives with good news. He tells the group that a helicopter is still available, giving them one final opportunity to evacuate. Before heading to the extraction point, Owen remembers the promise he made to Blue. Beta is still missing, and he refuses to leave without bringing the young dinosaur back. Ramsey warns him that the helicopter will depart in just 10 minutes. Knowing time is running out, Owen sets off in search of Beta. Alan and Maisie volunteer to help. After a determined search, they finally locate the young dinosaur. Maisie carefully distracts Beta while Owen quietly prepares a tranquilizer dart. The plan works perfectly. Beta is safely tranquilized, allowing them to transport her without causing any harm. Meanwhile, the forest fire continues spreading rapidly across the Biosyn sanctuary. The situation becomes so severe that even Dodgson is forced to abandon the facility. Desperate to escape, he boards the Hyperloop train. His relief is short-lived. Moments later, the power system fails, leaving the train stranded deep inside a dark tunnel. With no other choice, Dodgson climbs out and attempts to escape on foot. The decision proves fatal. A group of Dilophosaurus quickly discovers him in the darkness. Terrified, Dodgson desperately tries to flee, but there is nowhere to hide. Within moments, the predators surround him and bring his life to a violent end, marking the downfall of the man responsible for so much destruction. After regrouping, the survivors encounter Dr. Henry Wu. For the first time, Wu openly accepts responsibility for the global ecological crisis. He explains that Maisie's unique genetic makeup may hold the key to correcting the engineered locusts and reversing the catastrophic damage they have caused. After hearing Wu's explanation, Maisie agrees to help. With the facility collapsing around them, the group rushes toward the evacuation point, where Kayla is already waiting with the helicopter. Before they can escape, however, one final obstacle stands in their way. The sanctuary's two largest predators finally cross paths, and a colossal battle for dominance begins. The Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Giganotosaurus collide in a violent clash that shakes the entire area. As the giant dinosaurs fight, the survivors are forced to dodge falling debris while staying clear of the deadly confrontation. The battle is relentless. For much of the fight, the Giganotosaurus appears unstoppable, eventually overpowering the Tyrannosaurus and seemingly defeating it. Then a new challenger enters the conflict. The Therizinosaurus arrives, and its enormous claws transform the duel into a three-way struggle. Just when all hope appears lost, the Tyrannosaurus rises to its feet once again. Whether by instinct or coincidence, it joins forces with the Therizinosaurus to confront their common enemy. The final exchange is devastating. The Giganotosaurus is driven backward and impaled on the Therizinosaurus's massive claws. Mortally wounded, the giant predator collapses, bringing the battle to a dramatic end. The following morning, government authorities and news crews arrive at the sanctuary. As the investigation begins, former Biosyn employees come forward and expose the company's hidden crimes to the world. With the truth finally revealed, Biosyn's downfall becomes inevitable. For Ellie and Alan, the ordeal also brings a long-awaited personal reward. After years of missed opportunities and lives that repeatedly pulled them apart, they finally acknowledge their feelings for one another and begin a relationship together. Meanwhile, Owen, Claire, and Maisie prepare to return home. Having survived the nightmare and rescued everyone they came to save, they can finally look toward the future with peace of mind. In the weeks that follow, Dr. Henry Wu succeeds in developing a solution to the locust crisis. Using the insights gained from Maisie's unique DNA, he genetically alters the engineered insects, preventing the ecological disaster from spreading any further. The international community soon takes action. The United Nations officially designates the valleys surrounding Biosyn's former headquarters as a protected global sanctuary, ensuring that dinosaurs can live there safely without interference from the outside world. Back home, Owen fulfills the promise he made from the very beginning. He reunites Beta with Blue, allowing mother and daughter to be together once again. Before disappearing into the wilderness, Blue shares one final silent moment with Owen, acknowledging the unique bond they have built over the years. With that promise fulfilled, Owen returns to Claire and Maisie. For the first time in a long while, their family is finally able to enjoy a peaceful future together. But before we talk about the story, the dinosaurs, or the chaos that unfolds throughout the film, it's worth remembering just how much expectation and pressure this movie was carrying long before it ever reached theaters. Because Jurassic World Dominion wasn't just another sequel. It was marketed as the big one, the grand finale, the film that would bring together nearly 3 decades of Jurassic history into a single story. And that's a pretty exciting concept. For many people, Jurassic Park isn't simply another blockbuster. It's one of those rare films that holds a special place in movie history. Even today, fans still remember the first time they watched that towering Brachiosaurus step onto the screen. The sense of wonder, the unforgettable music, and the feeling that something impossible had suddenly become real left a lasting impression on an entire generation. The sequels that followed have always inspired mixed opinions. Some fans embraced them, while others felt they never captured the magic of the original. But regardless of where people stand on each installment, the franchise never truly disappeared. It always found a way to evolve and continue. Then Jurassic World arrived, introducing an entirely new generation to the series. New characters, larger-scale action, and even bigger spectacle defined this era. Not everyone agreed with its creative direction, but there's no denying that it brought the franchise back into the global spotlight. So when Dominion was announced, expectations naturally skyrocketed. It wasn't simply because another Jurassic movie was on the way. It was because the film promised something fans had been hoping to see for years, the return of the original trio, Laura Dern, Sam Neill, and Jeff Goldblum. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about Owen and Claire anymore. It felt like two different generations of the franchise were finally coming together. For longtime fans, that reunion alone was enough to create genuine excitement. And I think that's where much of the anticipation came from. Audiences weren't necessarily expecting the biggest dinosaur movie ever made. They were hoping for a meaningful payoff, something that connected everything that came before it and made this trilogy feel like a true conclusion rather than simply another sequel. The marketing leaned heavily into that promise. Every trailer, promotional image, and interview emphasized the same message: this was the culmination of the entire Jurassic saga. That's a risky promise to make. The moment a film presents itself as the grand finale, audiences naturally judge it by a different standard. Instead of asking, was it entertaining, they begin asking much larger questions. Was the journey worth it? Did bringing back the original cast actually matter? Did the story honor the legacy of Jurassic Park? And most importantly, did it truly earn the right to call itself the conclusion of the saga? Those are difficult questions, and whether Dominion succeeds or falls short depends largely on each viewer's answer. One thing, however, is impossible to deny. Very few films arrive carrying this much nostalgia, this much anticipation, and this much responsibility. Before the first dinosaur even appears on screen, Dominion is already trying to live up to nearly 30 years of audience expectations. That's an enormous challenge for any blockbuster. One of the most fascinating aspects of Dominion actually begins before the movie itself. It starts with the question that Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom left hanging in the air. Remember that final scene? Dinosaurs escaping into the modern world, flying above cities, roaming across open landscapes, and suddenly forcing humanity to share the planet with creatures that were never meant to exist in this era. For me, that ending felt incredibly powerful, not because it answered questions, but because it left so many unanswered. How would governments respond? What would happen to existing wildlife? Would dinosaurs become invasive species? Could humanity realistically adapt to living alongside them? The possibilities seemed endless, and the audience's imagination immediately began filling in the gaps. Honestly, there was even part of me that wondered whether the franchise could have ended right there. That final image was so compelling that perhaps leaving the consequences unexplored would have made it even more memorable. Fans could have debated its meaning for years. Instead, Dominion chooses to continue the story and show what happens next. On paper, that's exactly the movie many fans had wanted for decades. For years, the franchise kept dinosaurs confined to islands, theme parks, fenced enclosures, and controlled environments. Suddenly, those barriers no longer existed. The dinosaurs were free. The world itself had effectively become Jurassic Park. That's an incredibly compelling premise. The challenge is that once you open that door, expectations immediately become enormous. Audiences begin imagining entire societies adapting to the presence of dinosaurs. New laws, new industries, new dangers, changing ecosystems, and perhaps even a completely different relationship between humanity and the natural world. It's the kind of idea that feels almost limitless, which also makes it one of the most difficult concepts the franchise has ever attempted to explore. The possibilities are endless, which is exactly why some viewers ended up feeling frustrated, not because the premise was weak, but because it was so strong. When a story introduces an idea of that scale, audiences naturally want to explore it in depth. They want to see how everyday life has changed, how society has adapted, and what this new reality actually feels like. Most of all, they want to experience the consequences of the previous film's ending. That's where Dominion becomes especially interesting. The film does acknowledge that dinosaurs are now widespread. We see glimpses of it, news reports, public incidents, scattered encounters, and visual evidence that the world has fundamentally changed. But at the same time, the narrative doesn't remain fully anchored to that concept. It begins there, then gradually shifts toward other story priorities. For some viewers, that transition works just fine. They see the dinosaur-filled world as a backdrop rather than the central focus. For others, it feels like the film steps away from its most compelling idea. And I understand both perspectives. Because when Fallen Kingdom ended, it felt like the franchise had finally broken out of its long-standing formula. Dinosaurs were no longer contained on a remote island or isolated facility. They were now part of the real world. Everyone's world. That's a premise that almost sells itself. Which is why, years later, one of the biggest discussions surrounding Dominion isn't just what the movie includes, it's what some viewers feel it could have explored instead. Not because the idea lacked potential, but because it arguably had too much of it. The ending of Fallen Kingdom left audiences with a question that felt almost impossible to fully answer. Dominion spends much of its runtime trying to respond to that question, and whether its answer feels satisfying is where opinions begin to split. For years, every Jurassic film operated within a familiar framework. Dinosaurs existed somewhere else, an island, a research facility, a controlled enclosure. No matter how dangerous things became, there was always a boundary separating the prehistoric world from our own. Dominion begins by removing that boundary entirely. And honestly, that's what immediately draws attention. For the first time in the franchise, dinosaurs aren't confined to a park or hidden away from civilization. They are simply out there, living alongside humanity. The early part of the film leans into that idea. We see dinosaurs moving through snowy forests, interacting with modern wildlife, and becoming part of news cycles as governments attempt to regulate them. Dinosaur sightings are no longer extraordinary events, they're becoming routine disruptions in a changing world. It's a strange but fascinating concept. Humanity spent decades imagining what would happen if dinosaurs returned, and now the franchise is finally attempting to visualize that reality. There are moments where it genuinely feels fresh. You start noticing how unusual the world has become. A dinosaur sighting is no longer a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle, it's another problem for authorities to manage, another headline in a growing list of incidents. And that's where the film briefly feels different from what came before it. The threat is no longer contained. The entire world has shifted. What's also interesting is that the film doesn't present this as a complete collapse of civilization. Society hasn't fallen apart. Humanity hasn't retreated into hiding. Instead, the world is still functioning, just under new conditions. People adapt in different ways. Some exploit the presence of dinosaurs, some try to protect them, some fear them, and others profit from them. In many ways, it reflects a very human response to anything powerful or disruptive, adaptation, exploitation, and survival all happening at once. At its best, Dominion hints at a world shaped by complex relationships between humans and dinosaurs. These creatures are no longer treated as mythical attractions or science fiction monsters. They are animals, dangerous, unpredictable animals, but animals nonetheless. That shift in perspective is one of the more interesting ideas in the film. Dinosaurs are not always framed as villains. At times, they are simply wildlife. At other times, they are treated as property, or even as victims of human exploitation. It's a subtle but meaningful change, and in its best moments, it gives the franchise a slightly more grounded, mature tone. At the same time, that premise creates a natural challenge. Once a film shows audiences a world transformed by dinosaurs, curiosity fills in the gaps. Every glimpse raises new questions. How do cities function in this environment? How are ecosystems adapting? What role do governments play? What happens to farming, transportation, tourism, and public safety in a world where prehistoric predators are part of daily life? The film occasionally gestures toward these ideas, but mostly in brief flashes rather than sustained exploration. And that's why its central concept remains one of the most discussed aspects of Dominion, not because it fails, but because it is so inherently intriguing. For a moment, it feels like the franchise is stepping into entirely new territory. The fences are gone. The islands are behind us. Dinosaurs now exist within the modern world itself. Whether or not the film fully capitalizes on that idea, it remains one of the most compelling starting points the series has introduced in years. If the earlier films were about bringing dinosaurs back, Dominion is meant to ask what happens after that. It shifts the question entirely. Once dinosaurs are loose across the planet, the challenge is no longer about creation, it's about coexistence. And that's the idea that hangs over much of the film. Can humans and dinosaurs actually share the same world? On the surface, it sounds simple. In practice, the idea expands into something much larger. Throughout the film, we see small reminders that the world is adjusting. Dinosaurs are no longer isolated attractions behind fences. They are becoming part of everyday life. The film doesn't portray this new reality as outright collapse. Some are exploited. Civilization is simply trying to survive. Governments still operate. People continue with their daily lives. The difference is that humanity now shares the planet with another dominant force, massive, ancient creatures that were never meant to exist alongside modern society. That contrast is what makes the premise so compelling. At times, the film shows dinosaurs behaving less like cinematic monsters and more like real wildlife, migrating, competing for territory, and interacting with changing ecosystems. In those moments, you can see the outline of a much larger story about adaptation. Because coexistence doesn't mean harmony. It means adjustment. It means learning how to live in a world that has fundamentally changed. And that is exactly where some viewers found themselves wanting more. The idea is rich enough to support entire films built around its social, environmental, and political consequences. The possibilities feel almost limitless. Yet Dominion often treats coexistence as context rather than its central focus. The concept is present and important, but it rarely becomes the primary engine of the narrative. That isn't necessarily a flaw, it depends on expectations. Some viewers were satisfied using this new world as a backdrop for a more traditional adventure story. Others hoped the film would fully commit to exploring the implications of its own premise. Both reactions are understandable, because the movie repeatedly offers glimpses of a fascinating idea without always pausing long enough to fully develop it. It shows just enough of this transformed world to spark the imagination, just enough to suggest that dinosaurs are no longer outsiders, but part of something much bigger. They're residents now. Part of the equation. And in a strange way, that may be one of the most significant shifts the franchise has ever made. The original Jurassic Park posed a simple but profound question: should humanity bring dinosaurs back at all? Dominion changes the terms entirely. The dinosaurs are already here. The question is no longer about creation, it's about coexistence. Whether humans are capable of sharing the world with something that once ruled it. Even when the film moves in other directions, that idea lingers in the background, quietly reinforcing just how much has changed since those park gates first opened decades ago. One of the clearest realizations in Dominion is that the dinosaurs themselves are not really the primary antagonists. That role belongs to Biosyn. And in a sense, that's a direction the franchise has been circling for years. From the beginning, the real threat was never just the animals, it was the people who believed they could control them. The people who saw scientific wonder and immediately calculated profit margins. The people convinced that intelligence meant dominance over nature. Biosyn is the latest evolution of that idea. In Dominion, the company sits at the center of nearly everything. It is powerful, globally influential, technologically advanced, and publicly positioned as a force for good. On the surface, it appears to be helping manage a world now filled with dinosaurs, offering solutions to a problem humanity can no longer ignore. But as the story progresses, that surface begins to crack. What's interesting is that Biosyn isn't hidden away in a secret bunker or remote island laboratory. It operates in the open, like a legitimate multinational corporation. It has public trust, political leverage, and enough infrastructure to influence global events. That makes it feel more grounded, and arguably more unsettling, than a traditional shadowy villain organization. Because in theory, Dominion keeps returning to a familiar idea: when immense power exists without meaningful accountability, consequences follow. Biosyn isn't just studying dinosaurs. It's managing information, controlling research, restricting access, and shaping what the world is allowed to know. In many ways, it isn't just controlling the present, it's trying to shape the future. That's where the company becomes central to the film's broader themes. The dinosaurs may dominate the spectacle, but Biosyn represents something more familiar and arguably more relevant: human ambition, corporate influence, and the belief that every crisis can be engineered into a solution, packaged, and eventually monetized. The film repeatedly suggests that humanity hasn't truly learned from past mistakes. Instead of respecting the consequences of previous experiments, the cycle continues under new branding and new leadership. Biosyn becomes the modern expression of that repetition. What's also notable is how the company serves as a narrative convergence point. Nearly every major storyline eventually leads back to it: the ecological investigation, the search for Maisie, the involvement of the original Jurassic Park characters, and the journey of Owen and Claire. Everything gradually orbits around Biosyn. In that sense, the corporation functions almost like the structural center of the film's story. Whether that works for every viewer is another question. Some may see Biosyn as a familiar corporate antagonist, echoing countless other blockbuster villains. Others may appreciate how naturally it extends the franchise's long-standing cautionary themes about unchecked science and commercial exploitation. Either way, Biosyn isn't just background detail. It is the mechanism driving much of the conflict forward. And in a film filled with prehistoric predators, flying reptiles, and global chaos, Dominion ultimately circles back to a simple idea. The most dangerous force in the story isn't a dinosaur. It's the people who still believe they can control everything. The real issue isn't power itself, it's what people choose to do with it. And that's where the film leans heavily into its corporate greed narrative. At the center of everything is a simple idea: scientific breakthroughs become dangerous the moment profit enters the equation. Not because science is inherently flawed, but because someone, somewhere, will always see it as an opportunity to make money. That theme has been part of the Jurassic franchise from the very beginning. In the original film, the warning signs were already there. A groundbreaking scientific discovery was turned into a commercial attraction before anyone truly understood its consequences. Dominion expands that idea to a much larger scale. Instead of a theme park, the stakes now involve global influence, corporate reach capable of affecting entire populations. What makes this especially interesting is how the film repeatedly returns to a simple question: what happens when an organization becomes powerful enough to shape the future according to its own interests? The answer isn't delivered through speeches or philosophical monologues. It's shown through behavior, decisions made behind closed doors, research conducted without proper oversight, people reduced to assets rather than individuals, and nature reframed as something to be controlled and exploited. The film consistently frames greed as the driving force behind much of the chaos. Not survival. Not necessity. Greed. The pursuit of more control, more influence, more power. And that's where Dominion circles back to one of the franchise's oldest warnings: humanity keeps repeating the same mistake. Each generation believes it can manage forces that previous generations failed to control. Each generation assumes it will succeed where others failed. And each generation ends up creating new consequences it cannot fully contain. The dinosaurs may be prehistoric, but the behavior surrounding them is unmistakably modern: corporations competing for dominance, individuals chasing profit, and institutions prioritizing ambition over responsibility. Whether the film delivers this message with subtlety is debatable. Some viewers may find it very direct. But even so, the intention is hard to miss. The danger isn't just that humans created dinosaurs. It's that someone will always try to profit from that creation. And once enormous power becomes tied to enormous profit, good intentions tend to disappear quickly. That's what makes this theme so central to the film. Long after the dinosaur attacks fade into the background, the underlying warning remains unchanged. Technology evolves, science advances, even the creatures themselves may change, but human greed remains remarkably consistent. And Dominion spends a great deal of time reminding us that history tends to repeat itself when its lessons are ignored. Now, this is where the film takes an unexpected turn. Because if you walked into Dominion expecting the central conflict to revolve around dinosaurs taking over the world, you might be surprised to find that a significant portion of the story instead focuses on genetically engineered giant locusts. And that has become one of the most divisive aspects of the entire film, not because the locusts are irrelevant to the plot, but because they are central to almost everything that unfolds. The investigation, the corporate conspiracy, and the return of legacy characters all eventually circle back to them. So much of the story is ultimately tied to these insects. The question is whether audiences actually wanted that. It's a strange situation, because the idea itself isn't completely disconnected from the core themes of Jurassic Park. The franchise has always been interested in genetic manipulation and the unintended consequences of scientific interference. In theory, genetically engineered giant locusts fit right into that conversation. But in practice, it creates a very unusual viewing experience. You're watching a Jurassic film. You came for dinosaurs. The marketing was full of dinosaurs. The posters, the trailers, everything emphasized dinosaurs. And then, suddenly, the story keeps shifting back toward giant insects devastating crops. That's where many viewers began to feel a sense of disconnect. Not necessarily because the idea is bad, but because it feels like it belongs to a different kind of movie, an ecological disaster thriller, a corporate conspiracy story, or even a biotech-focused science fiction film rather than a dinosaur adventure. What's interesting is that the locust storyline is actually trying to engage with genuinely large-scale concerns: food security, agricultural control, environmental collapse, and the consequences of manipulating nature for profit. These are serious, relevant themes. They're just not the themes many people expected to take center stage in the final chapter of a Jurassic World trilogy. And that's where the reaction becomes so divided. Some viewers appreciated that the film attempted something different instead of simply repeating another dinosaur chase narrative. Others felt it drifted away from what makes the franchise special, because every moment spent on the locust plot is time not spent exploring the dinosaur-filled world established in the previous film. Personally, the biggest issue isn't the existence of the locust storyline, it's the amount of narrative weight it carries. It isn't a side plot. It isn't background detail. It functions as one of the main structural engines of the entire film. That means the audience's experience of Dominion often depends on whether they accept that shift in focus. If the premise works for you, the film gains an added layer of mystery and corporate investigation. If it doesn't, it can feel like the story keeps drifting away from its most compelling ideas. Either way, the locust crisis ends up becoming one of the most talked about elements of Dominion, not the dinosaurs, not the action set pieces, and not even the returning cast. The central question many viewers walk away with is surprisingly simple. How did the final chapter of the Jurassic World trilogy end up being so focused on giant locusts? And in a way, that reaction says everything about how unusual this narrative choice really is. Because beneath the dinosaur chases, corporate intrigue, and blockbuster spectacle, Dominion is ultimately trying to say something larger. It isn't just about dinosaurs. It's about nature as a system. One thing that becomes clear throughout the film is how often it returns to a single idea: humanity has a tendency to disrupt systems it barely understands. That concept has been part of Jurassic Park since the beginning. The original film wasn't really about dinosaurs, it was about human confidence in control. The belief that nature could be managed, packaged, and contained only to prove that nature does not respond to human expectations, business models, or safety protocols. Dominion expands that idea outward. Instead of a single isolated failure, it shifts toward global-scale consequences, ecosystems, food chains, wildlife populations, and environmental balance. The film repeatedly suggests that when humans interfere with natural systems, the effects do not remain contained for long. One intervention leads to another problem. That problem leads to another. And eventually, the consequences grow beyond control. What's particularly notable is that dinosaurs are no longer the sole representation of this disruption. They are only one part of a much larger, more complicated picture. Throughout the story, we see recurring concerns about species disruption, ecological imbalance, and the ripple effects of introducing powerful new variables into an already fragile system. The message is fairly clear: nature operates through balance, and once that balance is disturbed, restoring it is far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. While the film delivers this message through giant prehistoric creatures and genetically engineered organisms, the underlying concern feels surprisingly familiar. Questions about environmental responsibility, conservation, and humanity's relationship with the natural world are no longer abstract, they feel increasingly relevant in the real world as well. Dominion is not especially subtle in how it approaches these ideas, but it doesn't hide them either. In many ways, the film frames human arrogance as the root cause of ecological instability. Humanity doesn't simply observe nature, it alters it, exploits it, commercializes it, and then acts surprised when the consequences arrive. That pattern is something the franchise has explored since the very beginning, and Dominion continues that tradition, even if its execution sometimes divides opinion. What stands out is how the film occasionally treats dinosaurs less like monsters and more like wildlife placed in impossible circumstances by human intervention. They are not always villains. In some cases, they are victims of the same irresponsible decisions that endanger everything else. That shift in perspective adds an extra layer to the story. The central conflict stops being humans versus dinosaurs and becomes something more complicated: humans versus the consequences of their own actions. Whether Dominion fully develops those ideas is open to debate. There are moments where the film seems eager to explore them, and other moments where it prioritizes action and spectacle. But the themes are undeniably present. Beneath the chases, escapes, and large-scale chaos runs a quieter, persistent warning about ecological responsibility. At its core, the film keeps returning to a simple question: what happens when humanity refuses to respect the systems that maintain natural balance? And while Dominion doesn't always offer a definitive answer, it remains one of the more interesting questions it raises along the way. One thing that stands out throughout the film is how often it circles back to a warning that has defined the franchise since its inception. Just because something can be done, doesn't mean it should be. That idea has always been central to Jurassic Park. The dinosaurs were never the true problem, the problem was the decision to bring them back without fully understanding the consequences. Nearly 3 decades later, Dominion is still wrestling with the same idea. The difference now is scale. We are no longer dealing with a single isolated experiment on a remote island. The technology has evolved, the applications have expanded, and the consequences are now global. What's important is that the film does not portray science itself as inherently dangerous. In fact, science is also shown as a source of solutions. The tension arises when knowledge becomes separated from responsibility, when innovation outpaces ethics, and when possibility is pursued without enough consideration of necessity. That is the line Dominion continually explores. Throughout the story, scientific breakthroughs are treated like powerful tools. In the right hands, they can improve lives. In the wrong hands, they can generate consequences on a massive scale. From that tension emerges a series of ethical questions. Who decides how these technologies are used? Who regulates them? Who is accountable when things go wrong? The film repeatedly suggests that scientific progress without oversight becomes dangerous not because discovery is inherently wrong, but because human ambition often moves faster than human judgment. What makes this theme especially compelling is that it extends far beyond dinosaurs. The story is not only about prehistoric creatures, it is about genetic engineering, biological manipulation, and humanity's expanding ability to reshape life itself. At several points, the film presents a world where science has progressed so far that boundaries once considered impossible are now easily crossed. Species can be altered, DNA can be rewritten, and entire biological systems can be redesigned. The capability exists, the question is whether it is being used responsibly. Imagine growing up knowing that people value your genetic code more than your individuality, seeing you first as research material, and only afterward as a human being. It's a heavy burden for any character to carry. And while Dominion is primarily structured as an adventure film, there are moments where it quietly acknowledges that emotional weight. The search for Maisie becomes more than a rescue mission. It becomes a story about agency and ownership, about who gets to define a person's identity, and whether someone can ever truly be reduced to the science that created them. These ideas add a quieter layer of humanity beneath the larger spectacle. While corporations pursue data and scientists chase solutions, Maisie is simply trying to live a normal life. That's what makes her role so central. She sits at the intersection of nearly every major theme in the film: science, ethics, corporate ambition, genetic manipulation, and human responsibility. All of those threads converge on her in some way. Whether the film explores those ideas as deeply as it could is open to debate. At times, the fast-paced structure moves on before the emotional or philosophical implications can fully develop. But the themes are still present, and they give Maisie more depth than a typical character to be rescued. She becomes a reminder that behind every scientific breakthrough, every experiment, and every ambitious project, there are real human consequences. In a film filled with giant creatures and global threats, that personal perspective helps ground the story. Because at its core, Maisie's journey isn't really about genetics. It's about identity, about discovering who you are when the world keeps trying to define you for its own purposes. Another intriguing direction Dominion takes is showing what happens when dinosaurs stop being rare scientific marvels and start becoming commodities. Because realistically, the moment dinosaurs entered the wider world, there was never any chance humanity would simply leave them alone. Someone, somewhere, would try to profit from them, and that is exactly where the film goes. Early on, Dominion expands on a side of this new world that earlier entries only hinted at. Instead of focusing solely on research facilities and corporate laboratories, the story dips into illegal markets, underground networks, and opportunists who see dinosaurs as business assets. In many ways, it feels like one of the more believable evolutions of the franchise's premise. If rare animals are trafficked in the real world, if exotic species are traded illegally, and if organized crime consistently finds ways to profit from scarcity and demand, then dinosaurs would almost certainly become the most valuable black market resource imaginable. The movie leans into that idea fully. Suddenly, dinosaurs are no longer just wildlife, they become merchandise, weapons, entertainment, status symbols, and economic assets. And that's a surprisingly dark evolution of the franchise's central concept. Because it shows humanity repeating the same mistake again. Rather than learning to respect these creatures or reflecting on past disasters, people immediately begin finding ways to exploit them. Some breed them, some sell them, some use them for sport, and others turn them into tools for power and wealth. What's particularly interesting is that these sequences offer one of the few glimpses into how the wider world has adapted to dinosaurs being loose across the planet. For a brief stretch, the film takes on the rhythm of a crime thriller. It suggests an underground economy built entirely around prehistoric life. And honestly, that idea is fascinating, not because it's uplifting, but because it feels believable. Whenever something rare, dangerous, or valuable exists, human nature tends to build a market around it. In that sense, dinosaurs become just another extension of a familiar pattern. These scenes also reinforce one of the film's recurring themes: the greatest threat is not always the animals themselves, but what people choose to do with them. Again and again, Dominion suggests that human greed creates far more damage than the dinosaurs ever could. The creatures are often just caught in the middle, used, traded, controlled, and exploited, reduced to commodities rather than living beings. At the same time, the black market sequences give the film a different texture. The settings feel less familiar than the forests and research facilities seen elsewhere in the franchise. There's a brief sense that the story is stepping into new territory, revealing a world where dinosaurs have been absorbed into criminal networks and global commerce. Could the film have explored that idea further? Absolutely. In fact, it feels like a concept rich enough to sustain an entire movie on its own. But even in its limited screen time, the illegal dinosaur trade helps make the world feel larger, more complex, and more grounded. Because if dinosaurs truly existed in modern society, black markets wouldn't be an exception, they'd be inevitable. And Dominion understands that on at least a basic level. One of the biggest challenges Dominion faces is that it isn't telling a single, unified story. Instead, it is juggling multiple narratives at once. And whether that works for you will likely shape your entire experience of the film. From the outset, the movie divides its focus between separate groups of characters pursuing very different goals. On one side, Owen and Claire are dealing with Maisie's disappearance, a deeply personal crisis centered around protection, family, and survival. On the other, Ellie Sattler investigates a growing ecological threat, eventually reconnecting with Alan Grant and working alongside Ian Malcolm. Their storyline leans more toward investigation, mystery, and corporate conspiracy. For a significant portion of the film, these threads feel almost like separate stories unfolding in parallel. They take place in the same world, but they don't feel tightly connected beyond that shared setting. And that's where things get interesting, because the film's entire structure depends on eventually bringing all of these narrative threads together. You can almost feel Dominion trying to balance two different eras of the franchise at once, the Jurassic World era and the original Jurassic Park era. The newer characters have their own emotional arcs, while the legacy characters carry their own separate mission. The film spends a significant amount of time guiding both groups toward the same destination. In theory, it's a clever structure. Fans of the original trilogy get meaningful time with Alan, Ellie, and Malcolm, while audiences invested in the newer films still follow Owen and Claire at the center of the action. The intention is that no one feels excluded. At least, that's the idea. The challenge is that managing so many moving parts is inherently difficult. Every time the film cuts away from one storyline, it has to rebuild momentum when it returns. Every subplot demands attention. Every character requires narrative space. And with such a large ensemble, that balancing act becomes increasingly complex. There are moments where the structure works surprisingly well. The shifting storylines create variety. One sequence focuses on investigation, another on action, another on suspense. The constant movement helps prevent the film from settling into a single rhythm for too long. But there are also moments where the narrative begins to feel crowded. You can sense the film juggling multiple responsibilities at once, several protagonists, overlapping objectives, competing antagonists, and a wide range of thematic ideas. Sometimes these elements align cleanly. Other times, you can feel the strain of keeping everything connected. What's particularly interesting is that this dual-story approach reflects the film's broader purpose. Dominion isn't just trying to conclude a single trilogy, it's attempting to merge two distinct eras of Jurassic storytelling into one shared endpoint. And in doing so, the structure itself becomes part of the concept. The old heroes. The new heroes. The old consequences. The new consequences. Everything gradually converging toward a single finale. Whether that execution fully succeeds is open to interpretation. Some viewers appreciate the ambition and enjoy seeing both generations given meaningful space within the same narrative. Others feel the film becomes overextended, weighed down by the number of threads competing for attention. But regardless of where you stand, the dual-story structure remains one of the defining features of Dominion. It isn't just how the film is told, it's what the film is trying to do. It's the framework holding the entire story together. And that's also one of the main reasons the film often feels bigger, busier, and more complicated than any previous entry in the franchise. Let's be honest, when Laura Dern, Sam Neill, and Jeff Goldblum were announced for Dominion, the film instantly became more exciting for a lot of people, even before anyone knew what the story would be about. Before the trailers. Before the marketing campaign. Before reviews or plot details. Just seeing those names together again was enough. Because regardless of how people feel about the later Jurassic films, those three characters are deeply tied to what made the original Jurassic Park so iconic. Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, and Ian Malcolm aren't just characters to many fans, they're part of the franchise's identity. So when Dominion promised to reunite them on screen, expectations naturally skyrocketed. And to the film's credit, this isn't treated as a brief cameo situation. The movie doesn't simply bring them back for a few nostalgic moments before moving on. They are given a substantial presence within the story, complete with their own investigation, their own objectives, and their own narrative weight. That decision alone already separates Dominion from many legacy sequels that rely on older characters purely as marketing appeal. Now, whether every scene involving them fully works is another discussion. But their presence undeniably changes the tone of the film. The moment they appear, there's an immediate shift in energy, not because they're doing anything radically different, but because they bring the audience back to where this entire franchise began. There's a sense of history attached to them. Of time past. Of stories lived beyond what we see on screen. That weight naturally follows them into the film. What's especially interesting is how differently each character functions within the story. Ian Malcolm still carries much of the wit and sharp commentary audiences associate with him. Even when the film leans heavily into seriousness, he often cuts through it with moments of humor and personality. Ellie Sattler, on the other hand, drives much of the investigative thread, giving structure and forward momentum whenever the story begins to slow. Alan Grant feels, in many ways, like the audience's point of entry back into this world. Once again, he's pulled into situations he would clearly prefer to avoid, a fitting role for a character who has spent decades trying to stay away from dinosaur-related chaos. And then there's the chemistry between them. Arguably, that's the most important element. Because nostalgia alone isn't enough, if the actors don't naturally fit back into these roles, the reunion falls flat. Fortunately, there's still a believable rhythm between them, especially between Sam Neill and Laura Dern. Their interactions feel easy, lived in, and unforced, as though these characters have continued existing even between films. That kind of authenticity is difficult to replicate. At the same time, this reunion introduces its own challenge. The moment beloved legacy characters return, expectations shift. Audiences don't just want appearances or references, they expect impact. They expect significance. They expect the reunion to matter within the story itself. And that's where opinions start to split. Some viewers were simply happy to see these characters again, enjoying the time spent with them on screen. Others were looking for something more. For some viewers, that reunion alone delivered exactly what they wanted. For others, the film leaned too heavily on nostalgia and struggled to give its returning cast material that felt fully worthy of their legacy. It's a fair criticism. When characters carry this much history, expectations become almost impossible to satisfy in a way that feels universally agreed upon. Still, regardless of how effective the execution is, there's no denying the significance of seeing them together again. For the first time, the original heroes and the newer generation share the same adventure. The franchise finally places its past and present within the same frame. And even before you evaluate whether it fully works, that idea alone helps explain why Dominion generated so much anticipation in the first place. For many fans, seeing these characters step back into the Jurassic universe wasn't just another plot development, it felt like a return to something familiar. A kind of cinematic homecoming. From the moment Dominion was announced, there was one thing everyone expected it to lean into heavily: nostalgia. And honestly, how could it not? This franchise spans nearly 3 decades. Entire generations have grown up with Jurassic Park. Some experienced it in theaters in 1993. Others discovered it through television, home video, streaming platforms, or later entries like Jurassic World. No matter how someone enters the franchise, there's a strong chance they carry some emotional connection to it. Dominion understands that well. Throughout the film, there are numerous moments designed to remind audiences of where this journey began. Familiar faces return. Visual callbacks reappear. Character dynamics resurface. Even small exchanges between characters often feel like they're quietly acknowledging longtime viewers. And to be fair, some of those moments land effectively. Because nostalgia isn't inherently a flaw. When used carefully, it can deepen emotional impact. It can make a moment resonate more strongly simply because of the history behind it. A look between two characters can carry more weight than pages of dialogue, because the audience already understands what they've endured together. That is one of Dominion's biggest advantages. It doesn't need to build every emotional connection from the ground up. Some of those connections already span decades. The challenge comes when nostalgia begins to carry more narrative weight than the story itself. That's where opinions divide. For some viewers, the callbacks feel like genuine celebrations of the franchise's history, moments that acknowledge continuity and reward long-term investment. For others, certain scenes feel less like storytelling and more like recognition prompts. A nod to the audience. A deliberate attempt to trigger memory rather than develop narrative momentum. And the difference between those two approaches is subtle, but important. Dominion constantly walks that line, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. What's particularly interesting is that the film almost seems aware of its own legacy burden. It recognizes that audiences are entering the theater with decades of expectations, memories, and emotional associations already attached. Instead of resisting that, it embraces it. The result is a film that often feels like a reunion as much as a sequel, not just for the characters on screen, but for the audience as well. You aren't only following a story. You're revisiting old relationships, old ideas, and old emotional landmarks that have been sitting with viewers for years. Even some familiar narrative rhythms return, not always because they are necessary, but because they are recognizable. And that recognition, whether comforting or limiting, is one of the defining experiences of Jurassic World Dominion. And that's where nostalgia becomes both a strength and a weakness. Because every time Dominion reminds you of Jurassic Park, it also reminds you of the extremely high standard that film set. That's a difficult comparison for any sequel to survive. The more the movie celebrates its past, the more it invites audiences to measure the present against it. Some viewers appreciate that connection. Others may find themselves wishing the film invested more energy into creating new emotional landmarks instead of revisiting old ones. But regardless of where you stand, nostalgia is woven into almost every corner of Dominion. It isn't just part of the tone, it's part of the identity. It shapes the marketing, the emotional framing, and even the way the story is structured. In many ways, it becomes part of the film's strategy for engaging the audience at all. Because Dominion isn't only trying to tell a new story. It's also trying to acknowledge everything that came before it. Whether that approach feels earned, excessive, or somewhere in between depends entirely on the viewer. But there's no denying that the film treats its legacy as one of its most valuable assets, and it is not hesitant to use it. While much of the attention surrounding Dominion understandably centers on the return of the original Jurassic Park cast, it's easy to forget that this is still, at its core, Owen and Claire's story, at least at the beginning. When we first reconnect with them, they are no longer the same people introduced in Jurassic World. They've endured multiple disasters, survived countless dinosaur encounters, and settled into a very different kind of existence. The biggest shift is Maisie. Protecting her has become their entire world, and that's what gives their storyline its emotional foundation. For the first time, Owen and Claire aren't trying to save a park, expose a corporate conspiracy, or survive a large-scale catastrophe. They are trying to function as caretakers, something closer to parents than action heroes. And that's where tension naturally emerges. Because their idea of protection doesn't always align with Maisie's desire for independence. The film explores this dynamic in a fairly grounded way. Owen and Claire genuinely want to keep her safe, but their constant monitoring and restrictions leave Maisie feeling isolated and controlled. It's a believable conflict, especially given the context. After all, they aren't protecting an ordinary teenager, they are protecting someone who is actively being pursued by powerful organizations. Once Maisie disappears, the narrative shifts into full rescue mode, and from that point on, Owen and Claire become major drivers of the film's action. Car chases, motorcycle pursuits, dinosaur encounters, narrow escapes, and fast-moving set pieces dominate their storyline. The film rarely allows them to remain still for long. What's interesting is how differently the two characters function at this stage of the trilogy. Claire feels significantly evolved from her original portrayal in Jurassic World. She's more compassionate, more emotionally engaged, and increasingly willing to put herself at risk for others. Owen, on the other hand, remains largely consistent with his established role, the survivalist, the dinosaur specialist, the character who repeatedly finds himself in close proximity to apex predators that should realistically end the encounter far earlier than they do. That consistency isn't necessarily a flaw. The character has a clear narrative function within the franchise, and Dominion leans into it. At the same time, audience reactions to their storyline are mixed. Some viewers appreciate the continuity and familiarity they bring after multiple films. There is a comfort in following characters who already feel established within this world. Others feel that the presence of the returning Jurassic Park trio occasionally overshadows Owen and Claire, making it harder for their arc to feel like the central emotional focus of the film. When we first reconnect with them, they are no longer the same people introduced in Jurassic World. They've endured multiple disasters, survived countless dinosaur encounters, and settled into a very different kind of existence. The biggest shift is Maisie. Protecting her has become their entire world, and that's what gives their storyline its emotional foundation. For the first time, Owen and Claire aren't trying to save a park, expose a corporate conspiracy, or survive a large-scale catastrophe. They are trying to function as caretakers, something closer to parents than action heroes. And that's where tension naturally emerges. Because their idea of protection doesn't always align with Maisie's desire for independence. The film explores this dynamic in a fairly grounded way. Owen and Claire genuinely want to keep her safe, but their constant monitoring and restrictions leave Maisie feeling isolated and controlled. It's a believable conflict, especially given the context. After all, they aren't protecting an ordinary teenager, they are protecting someone who is actively being pursued by powerful organizations. Once Maisie disappears, the narrative shifts into full rescue mode, and from that point on, Owen and Claire become major drivers of the film's action. Car chases, motorcycle pursuits, dinosaur encounters, narrow escapes, and fast-moving set pieces dominate their storyline. The film rarely allows them to remain still for long. What's interesting is how differently the two characters function at this stage of the trilogy. Claire feels significantly evolved from her original portrayal in Jurassic World. She's more compassionate, more emotionally engaged, and increasingly willing to put herself at risk for others. Owen, on the other hand, remains largely consistent with his established role, the survivalist, the dinosaur specialist, the character who repeatedly finds himself in close proximity to apex predators that should realistically end the encounter far earlier than they do. That consistency isn't necessarily a flaw. The character has a clear narrative function within the franchise, and Dominion leans into it. At the same time, audience reactions to their storyline are mixed. Some viewers appreciate the continuity and familiarity they bring after multiple films. There is a comfort in following characters who already feel established within this world. Others feel that the presence of the returning Jurassic Park trio occasionally overshadows Owen and Claire, making it harder for their arc to feel like the central emotional focus of the film. As a result, their story sometimes feels like one strand among several competing priorities rather than the singular backbone of the narrative. And honestly, that's understandable. Dominion is trying to balance two generations of heroes simultaneously, which inevitably means attention gets divided. Still, Owen and Claire remain crucial to the structure of the film. Their search for Maisie provides urgency, their relationship provides emotional grounding, and their perspective keeps the story anchored to the Jurassic World trilogy rather than turning entirely into a Jurassic Park reunion piece. Whether they're someone's favorite characters or not, their journey serves a clear narrative function. They represent the modern era of the franchise, the bridge between where Jurassic World began and where Dominion ultimately ends. And while the dinosaurs dominate the marketing, the action, and most of the spectacle, much of the film's emotional momentum still rests on Owen and Claire trying to protect the family they've built in a world that has become increasingly difficult to control. One of the most noticeable things about Dominion is that it doesn't suffer from a lack of characters, it almost suffers from the opposite problem. The cast is enormous. You have the original Jurassic Park trio, Owen and Claire, Maisie, Henry Wu, bias-in personnel, new allies, new antagonists, and multiple supporting figures spread across intersecting storylines. The question that naturally follows is simple: does everyone get enough room to matter? And that's where Dominion becomes inconsistent. Some characters arrive with clear motivations and defined roles. Even with limited screen time, they feel grounded because their purpose in the story is immediately understandable. You know what they want, why they're there, and what drives them forward. Others are less fortunate. At times, certain characters feel less like fully developed individuals and more like functional pieces within a very large narrative machine. They appear because the plot requires movement, because someone needs to deliver information, trigger an event, or move the story into its next location. When that happens, emotional investment becomes harder to maintain. What Dominion does particularly well, however, is its smaller moments. Brief conversations, reunions, reactions, and quieter exchanges between characters often land more effectively than the large-scale set pieces. In those scenes, the film isn't trying to advance multiple plotlines at once. It simply allows the characters to exist, interact, and breathe. The challenge, ultimately, is scale. Dominion is attempting to function as a global adventure, a corporate conspiracy thriller, a dinosaur survival film, a legacy sequel, and a franchise conclusion, all at the same time. Each of those ambitions requires narrative space, and as a result, character development is occasionally compressed in favor of forward momentum. The story keeps moving. The locations keep shifting. The stakes keep escalating. And in the process, some of the quieter character work gets left behind in the rush. But not every character receives enough space to grow alongside those events. This becomes especially noticeable because the franchise has such a strong history of memorable personalities. When audiences think back to Jurassic Park, they don't just remember the dinosaurs, they remember the people. They remember how those characters reacted to wonder, fear, discovery, and survival. That's a difficult standard for any sequel to meet. Dominion certainly tries to give its large ensemble meaningful moments, but the results vary widely. Some characters emerge as highlights, others feel underutilized, a few are more memorable because of the performances than the writing itself, and some simply get lost within the scale of the story. That doesn't mean the film fails on a character level, far from it. There are genuine moments of warmth, humor, and connection scattered throughout. The issue is consistency. With so many intersecting storylines competing for attention, the film rarely has enough space to fully explore each character in the way it might have intended. In the end, Dominion's character writing reflects the broader strengths and weaknesses of the film as a whole. It is ambitious, crowded, and constantly trying to balance multiple narrative priorities at once. At times, that ambition produces engaging interactions and memorable beats. At other times, it leaves certain characters feeling like they deserved more room to breathe. And that, in many ways, becomes one of the film's defining patterns, not a lack of ideas, but too many ideas sharing the same space. Every Jurassic film eventually introduces some form of human antagonist. Not because dinosaurs aren't dangerous enough, but because the franchise has always been interested in a very specific kind of villain, the person who believes they are smarter than the consequences. In Dominion, that role belongs to Louis Dodgson, the head of Biosyn, positioned at the center of the film's corporate and ethical conflicts. What's interesting is that Dodgson is not framed as a traditional blockbuster villain. He is not a military figure trying to weaponize dinosaurs. He is not leading armies or engaging in overt displays of force. Instead, his influence is bureaucratic and institutional. He operates through resources, systems, and control, through offices, laboratories, and corporate authority rather than direct confrontation. In theory, that is a strong direction for a Jurassic antagonist. The franchise has always worked best when it highlights how large-scale disasters often begin with seemingly rational decisions made by ordinary people who underestimate the consequences. In that sense, Dodgson fits neatly into the franchise's long-running themes. He is another example of someone who believes he can manage forces beyond human control, someone convinced that intelligence, structure, and authority are enough to contain outcomes that are inherently unpredictable. The issue, however, is that many viewers did not find him particularly compelling or intimidating in practice. For a character positioned at the center of so much conflict, Dodgson often feels detached from the film's most memorable moments. He is present in the narrative and essential to its structure, but he rarely dominates scenes in the way iconic antagonists typically do. As a result, when audiences reflect on Dominion, they are more likely to recall the dinosaurs, the returning legacy characters, or the major set pieces than the central villain himself. And in a story like this, that usually signals a missed opportunity. Part of the challenge lies in how the film handles his personality and presence, which tends to keep him at a distance from the immediacy of the action, rather than embedding him within it in a more forceful or memorable way. Rather than presenting him as terrifying, charismatic, or emotionally complex, the film leans heavily into the image of a wealthy corporate executive whose ambition has gone too far. There's nothing inherently wrong with that concept. In fact, it fits the themes of the story quite well. But concepts and execution are two very different things. A villain can embody important ideas while still struggling to leave a lasting dramatic impression, and that is where Dodgson often finds himself. He functions less as a character audiences are meant to fear or hate, and more as a symbol of the film's broader concerns: corporate power, scientific irresponsibility, and unchecked greed. That symbolic role gives him narrative importance, but it doesn't always translate into strong on-screen presence. What's interesting is that the movie repeatedly tells us how powerful and influential he is. We understand his position. We understand his resources. We understand the scale of damage his decisions can cause. And yet emotionally, he often feels overshadowed by everything happening around him. The dinosaurs feel more imposing. The returning legacy characters feel more significant. Even certain supporting figures occasionally leave a stronger impression. And for a central antagonist, that creates a difficult problem. Still, Dodgson serves an essential function within the story. He embodies some of the franchise's oldest warnings: the belief that profit outweighs responsibility, that innovation excuses recklessness, and that control is achievable right up until the moment it isn't. In that sense, he is a very Jurassic kind of villain, not because he is physically threatening, but because he represents the recurring human flaw at the center of the franchise: the refusal to learn from past consequences. And Dominion spends much of its runtime showing what happens when that mindset is allowed to scale. One of the more overlooked elements of Dominion is what it does with Henry Wu, and that's understandable. When a film is juggling giant dinosaurs, returning legacy characters, global conspiracies, and multiple intersecting storylines, a character like Wu can easily fade into the background. But when viewed in the context of the entire franchise, he is actually one of its most important figures. Unlike most characters, Wu has been present since the beginning of these events. Long before Jurassic World opened, before the dinosaurs escaped, and before Bison entered the picture, he was already part of the scientific foundation that made it all possible. In many ways, he represents the scientific core of the Jurassic saga: the pursuit of discovery, the excitement of innovation, and the unintended consequences that follow when those pursuits outpace ethical reflection. What's notable about Dominion is how it reshapes his role. Earlier films often positioned Wu closer to the origin of the problem. He wasn't necessarily portrayed as outright villainous, but he was frequently depicted as someone willing to push ethical boundaries in the name of scientific progress, where curiosity often outweighed caution. Dominion shifts that framing. For perhaps the first time, Wu is presented as someone who is no longer detached from the consequences of his actions. Instead, he appears burdened by them. The outcomes of years of research, failed containment, ecological disruption, unintended biological consequences, are no longer abstract. They are immediate, visible, and irreversible. That realization becomes central to his arc. Rather than continuing the same trajectory, Wu begins searching for a way to mitigate the damage, not to erase the past, not to undo everything, but to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. That distinction matters. In stories like this, redemption rarely comes from denying responsibility. It comes from finally acknowledging it. Whether the film fully explores that idea is open to interpretation. Some viewers may feel his arc moves too quickly. Others may wish there was more space dedicated to his guilt and internal reckoning. Given how many narrative threads Dominion is managing, those limitations are understandable. Still, the intention is clear. Wu's storyline becomes a reflection of scientific ambition and consequence, of a man who helped push boundaries for years, only to realize that crossing those boundaries created problems far beyond his control. The other version wants to be a fast-paced dinosaur adventure that constantly moves from one set piece to the next. And Dominion keeps shifting between those two identities, sometimes within the same sequence. That tension is probably the clearest explanation for why the writing feels uneven at times. It isn't a lack of ideas. If anything, it's the opposite, too many ideas competing for the same space. When the film leans into its quieter moments, the character work actually has room to breathe. Conversations between returning characters like Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, and Ian Malcolm carry a sense of history that doesn't need much exposition. You can feel the years between them, the shared experiences, and the unspoken understanding that comes from surviving something as extraordinary as the original Jurassic Park incident. Similarly, the newer generation led by Owen Grady, Claire Dearing, and Maisie Lockwood provides a more immediate, grounded emotional thread. Their story is more personal and reactive, focused on protection, identity, and survival in a world that has become increasingly unstable. In theory, these two narrative groups complement each other well. The issue is that Dominion rarely stays in one emotional register for long enough to fully develop either side. Just as a scene begins to build intimacy or tension, the film often cuts away to advance another subplot or deliver new exposition. That constant movement keeps the story active, but it can also prevent emotional momentum from fully settling. Even the film's central corporate conflict, driven by Louis Dodgson and the Biosyn storyline, reflects this imbalance. The ideas are clear: corporate control, scientific exploitation, ecological consequences, but the execution sometimes prioritizes explaining the system over letting the drama unfold within it. Meanwhile, Henry Wu serves as one of the more introspective anchors in the story. His arc attempts to confront responsibility and consequence, but like many elements in the film, it competes with a large number of parallel storylines that demand attention. Ultimately, the screenplay feels like it's constantly negotiating with itself. It wants to conclude character arcs, expand world building, deliver spectacle, and explore thematic ideas about nature and control, all within a single narrative structure. Occasionally, those goals align and the film becomes genuinely engaging. At other times, they pull in different directions. That's why Dominion remains such a divisive entry. Not because it lacks material worth exploring, but because it often feels like it's trying to explore everything at once. Top of form. Bottom of form. For others, though, those gaps become the very thing that stands out most. When a film introduces a premise as large as dinosaurs existing across the modern world, it naturally invites scrutiny. Not because every detail needs to be spelled out, but because the concept itself feels like it demands more sustained attention than the film can realistically give it. That tension sits at the heart of many discussions about the screenplay. The movie is constantly balancing immediacy with implication. It shows enough to establish that the world has changed, but not always enough to fully explore what that change means on a systemic level. As a result, some of the most intriguing questions the premise raises are left hanging in the background rather than becoming active parts of the narrative. This is also where the film's blockbuster identity becomes both a strength and a limitation. As a large-scale adventure, it prioritizes momentum. Scenes are designed to move quickly, escalate stakes, and transition between locations without losing energy. That pacing helps maintain spectacle, especially in sequences involving dinosaurs and survival situations. But it also leaves less room for slower, more investigative storytelling that might have explored the world building in greater depth. So the result is a film that often feels like it is hinting at a much larger story happening just outside the frame. Cities adapting, ecosystems shifting, governments reacting, industries evolving, all of it is acknowledged, but only partially explored. And that's really where audience responses tend to diverge. Some see that restraint as focus, a decision to keep the story centered on its characters rather than expanding into a broader geopolitical or ecological saga. Others see it as missed potential, especially given how expansive the premise of Jurassic World Dominion already is. Neither interpretation is entirely wrong. It just depends on what someone expects the film to prioritize: tight, character-driven survival storytelling, or a fuller exploration of a world fundamentally reshaped by prehistoric life. What makes the discussion around the film so persistent is that it doesn't settle comfortably into either approach. Instead, it sits somewhere in between, offering enough world-building to spark curiosity, while keeping its narrative structure firmly rooted in blockbuster pacing and set-piece-driven progression. And that middle ground, while ambitious, is also where many of the film's most debated creative choices tend to live. When a story is this dense, pacing becomes subjective in a very specific way. The slower sections aren't always slow in terms of events, they're often busy with explanation, world-building, or character positioning. Meanwhile, the faster sections aren't necessarily more complex, they're just more visually and emotionally immediate. So depending on what a viewer values more, either half of the experience can feel slightly out of balance. That's why the same film can be described in two completely different ways without either description being entirely wrong. If someone is more engaged by narrative construction, setup, and thematic framing, they may feel the film spends too long assembling its pieces. If someone is more focused on momentum, action, and escalation, they may feel the film never slows down enough to breathe. And underneath both reactions is the same underlying structure, a screenplay trying to support an unusually large number of moving parts. The movie is constantly negotiating between character arcs, franchise continuity, thematic ideas about nature and control, and the expectations of a blockbuster dinosaur adventure. Every one of those priorities affects how the runtime feels. That's also why the experience of watching the film can change depending on expectations going in. A viewer anticipating a tightly focused survival story will notice the fragmentation more. A viewer expecting a sprawling, multi-threaded finale will be more forgiving of the structural sprawl. In that sense, the pacing debate isn't really about individual scenes, it's about what kind of film people expected Jurassic World Dominion to be. And because the movie attempts to function in several different modes at once, it naturally ends up inviting multiple, sometimes conflicting interpretations of how well it holds together. Top of form. Bottom of form. But even here, the same structural tension shows up again in a different form. The action isn't just a sequence of isolated set pieces, it's part of the same overloaded narrative architecture that affects the pacing and story balance. Because there are so many threads running at once, the action scenes often have to serve multiple purposes beyond spectacle. They need to advance character arcs, reposition plotlines, introduce or resolve conflicts, and sometimes even deliver exposition while still functioning as high-energy sequences. That's why the strongest action moments tend to be the ones that feel the most self-contained. The Malta sequence works for many viewers precisely because it temporarily simplifies everything. For a brief period, the film stops trying to juggle multiple narrative obligations and focuses on immediate stakes: pursuit, survival, movement, and spatial clarity. In that mode, the movie doesn't feel like it's explaining itself, it just happens. Outside of those moments, the action can feel slightly more burdened by narrative responsibility. Instead of being purely reactive and instinctive, sequences sometimes carry the weight of the larger plot structure. That doesn't make them ineffective, but it does change how they're experienced. You're not just watching dinosaurs create chaos, you're also watching the story try to solve logistical problems within its own framework. This ties back into one of the broader patterns running through the entire film: constant escalation. Each set piece tends to lead directly into another, which keeps momentum high but also reduces breathing space between ideas. Earlier entries in the franchise often allowed more contrast between calm and chaos, which made individual encounters feel more distinct. Here, the density of events creates a more continuous survival rhythm. Still, it's important to separate criticism of structure from execution. On a purely moment-to-moment level, many sequences in Jurassic World Dominion are competently staged, visually clear, and designed with scale in mind. The issue for some viewers isn't whether the action works in isolation, but how it accumulates over time. When everything is high stakes, high energy, and high urgency, the emotional peaks can start to blend together. And that's where audience response again splits in two directions. Some viewers find the constant motion exciting, almost like a sustained ride where the lack of downtime is part of the appeal. Others begin to feel the diminishing contrast between sequences, where each new encounter has to compete with the intensity of the one before it. So even in its most straightforward element, its action, the film reflects the same underlying reality seen throughout its writing and pacing: abundance. Not a shortage of ideas or spectacle, but an excess of it, all competing for attention within the same narrative space. That balance is really the key to how the film approaches its identity as a whole. It isn't trying to commit fully to horror, nor is it aiming to be purely action-driven in a traditional blockbuster sense. Instead, it moves fluidly between modes, sometimes within the same sequence, depending on what the story needs at that moment. A scene might begin with suspense, lean briefly into horror-inspired tension, and then escalate into full action almost immediately afterward. That kind of tonal shifting is part of what gives the film its energy, but it also explains why its scariest ideas often feel slightly underexplored. Suspense, by nature, relies on duration. It needs time to build uncertainty, to let the audience sit with not knowing what comes next. When that build is interrupted or resolved quickly, the emotional peak can feel more like a transition point than a sustained experience. Earlier entries in the franchise often gave those quieter, tension-heavy moments more breathing room. The danger wasn't just the presence of dinosaurs, but the anticipation of them. Jurassic Park in particular leaned heavily on that principle, using sound design, pacing, and restraint to make absence feel as threatening as presence. Jurassic World Dominion occasionally revisits that approach, and when it does, the results are often among its most effective sequences. The film briefly slows down, reduces informational clutter, and allows spatial awareness and uncertainty to carry the scene. In those moments, the dinosaurs feel less like set-piece engines and more like unpredictable forces moving just outside human control. But because the film's overall structure is built around constant progression, new location, new threat, new objective, those suspense-driven segments tend to be temporary rather than foundational. They function more like tonal accents within a larger action framework rather than sustained stylistic choices. That's why audience responses to the film's horror elements are so divided. For some viewers, even brief returns to suspense are enough to evoke what they loved about earlier installments. For others, those moments feel like glimpses of a different version of the movie, one that appears briefly, then yields again to the demands of scale and spectacle. Ultimately, the film's relationship with horror is similar to its relationship with everything else. It's present, it's intentional, but it's not always given the time or structural space to fully develop. And that, more than any single creative decision, is what defines the overall experience. Even in a franchise that has long since moved past pure novelty, the movie occasionally manages to recreate that original sense of discovery, not by reinventing dinosaurs themselves, but by reframing how they exist within the world. When the film slows down enough to let a creature simply be, rather than immediately turning it into a chase trigger or a combat set piece, it briefly reconnects with what made the premise compelling in the first place. That's why the quieter observational moments often stand out more than the larger action beats. A dinosaur moving through an environment, interacting with terrain, or behaving like a territorial animal rather than a narrative obstacle carries a different kind of impact. It shifts the focus from what happens next, to what is it like to live in a world where this exists. That question has always been the emotional foundation of the franchise, even when the films don't always prioritize it. The introduction of new species in Jurassic World Dominion also plays into that idea of expanding familiarity without losing scale. At this point in the series, innovation isn't just about size or danger, it's about texture. Small design differences, behavioral cues, and ecological framing become just as important as raw spectacle. That's why even brief appearances from lesser-seen creatures can register strongly. They momentarily refresh the viewer's mental map of what this world contains. The film also benefits from occasionally stepping back from the instinct to frame every dinosaur as a narrative antagonist. When creatures are allowed to function as environmental presences, part of a living system rather than a plot function, the world feels more coherent and less staged. That approach doesn't eliminate danger, but it contextualizes it differently. The threat becomes situational rather than inherently villainous. Of course, the trade-off is that a film structured around constant narrative momentum can't always maintain that observational mode for long. Jurassic World Dominion is still built as a blockbuster first, which means those moments of quiet wonder are often temporary pauses between more structured sequences of conflict and movement. But even brief returns to that tone tend to stand out precisely because they contrast with the surrounding pace. And that contrast might be the most consistent emotional pattern in the film overall: moments of reflection followed by escalation, curiosity followed by urgency, observation followed by pursuit. When those rhythms align, the movie feels closest to the spirit of the original idea, humanity encountering something vast and uncontrollable. When they don't, the spectacle remains, but the sense of discovery becomes more intermittent. Still, even in its most overloaded form, the franchise continues to rely on that foundational appeal. No matter how many sequels are added, or how familiar certain creatures become, there's still a lingering expectation that each new entry will find at least a few moments where the viewer pauses, not to watch a chase, but to simply recognize the strangeness of a world where dinosaurs are part of reality. One thing Jurassic World Dominion really nails is the dinosaurs. Say what you want about the story or how everything is paced, but the creatures themselves look genuinely impressive most of the time. Every time a new species shows up or we get a fresh angle on an old favorite, the movie leans hard into that wow factor it's been chasing since the original Jurassic Park. And honestly, it's easy to forget how far things have come. Back in 1993, those dinosaurs felt groundbreaking because they looked believable enough to trick your brain. Now, Dominion takes advantage of modern CGI to push that even further. The dinosaurs move with more detail, their skin and muscle work feels more layered, and even their subtle expressions are much more convincing than what earlier sequels could manage. What helps a lot is that the movie doesn't rely only on CGI. There's still a mix of practical effects and animatronics in there, and you can actually feel it in certain scenes. When actors have something real to interact with, the whole thing just lands better. It makes the dinosaurs feel like they're actually sharing space with the characters instead of just being added later in post-production. The film also throws a huge variety of environments at them: forests, snow, cities, labs, and somehow the visual effects keep up without falling apart. That consistency matters, because once the illusion breaks, the whole franchise loses its impact. Here, though, it mostly holds together. Even if you're not fully on board with the plot, it's hard to deny the craftsmanship on display. The effects team clearly put serious effort into making these creatures feel alive again, and in that sense, Dominion at least delivers where it counts for this franchise. Dominion works best when you step back and just take in how big everything feels. Whatever you think about the writing, the characters, or the structure, the dinosaurs and the world they move through are rarely the problem. In fact, most people come away agreeing on one thing: visually, the film delivers where it matters most. What often gets overlooked is that it's not just the dinosaurs that look good, it's the entire film. From the opening moments, there's a clear sense that this is a large-scale production trying to expand the scope of the franchise. Earlier entries were mostly locked into isolated islands, labs, or dense jungle settings. Dominion breaks out of that pattern and pushes into a much wider range of environments: snowy regions, cities, forests, mountains, and underground facilities. That variety keeps the film from feeling visually repetitive, even when the story itself slows down. Cinematography plays a big role in selling that expansion. The camera frequently pulls back to emphasize scale, not only showing how massive the dinosaurs are, but also how small the human characters feel inside this expanded world. Wide shots are used to reinforce the idea that dinosaurs are no longer confined to controlled spaces, they're part of a global ecosystem now. Different locations also bring different moods. Some scenes aim for awe and discovery, others lean into tension or suspense, and a few even drift into horror territory. Production design helps make those shifts work, with each setting designed to shape how a scene feels. A sterile lab heightens unease, natural environments create vulnerability, and urban spaces introduce unpredictability. What also stands out is that the film doesn't rely only on dinosaurs to carry the visuals. Atmosphere matters just as much. Lighting, weather, architecture, and environmental detail all contribute to making the world feel active rather than decorative. Even quieter moments often have something visually engaging happening in the background. That said, not everything is perfectly clean. Some action scenes become a bit chaotic when the editing speeds up and too much is happening at once, which can affect clarity. But those moments are relatively few compared to how consistently strong the overall visual presentation is. Even with its uneven pacing and occasional overcrowded action, there's a clear intent behind Dominion that's hard to ignore. It's trying to operate on a scale that feels final, like it wants to bring multiple strands of the franchise together while still keeping the momentum of a summer blockbuster. That ambition shows up in almost every sequence, even when the execution doesn't fully land. The direction often swings between control and chaos. Some moments are carefully staged, letting tension build in a slow, almost classic thriller style. Others feel more reactive, cutting quickly between characters, dinosaurs, and shifting environments. That contrast can be exciting, but it can also make certain scenes feel less focused than they should be. What stands out, though, is that the film rarely stops trying. There's a constant push to keep things moving, to escalate stakes, to shift locations or introduce new conflicts. That energy keeps the film from ever feeling empty, even when it becomes a bit overwhelming. At its core, Dominion feels like a movie that's less interested in perfection and more interested in scale and variety. It wants to be a conclusion, a continuation, and a reinvention all at once. That combination doesn't always come together cleanly, but it does explain why the film feels so dense and constantly in motion. In the end, even if the structure feels scattered, the intent behind it is clear, to make the world feel fully open, unstable, and alive with possibility again. And that's where the film still manages to hold attention, even when everything else feels uneven. That balancing act between legacy characters and the newer cast is one of Dominion's biggest storytelling hurdles. The film is constantly trying to give space to both groups, and while it mostly manages to keep things coherent, you can feel the strain in how scenes are structured. Some moments lean heavily into nostalgia, while others try to push the newer storyline forward, and the transition between the two isn't always seamless. Still, the return of the original trio carries real weight. There's an immediate sense of recognition when they appear, not because the movie forces it, but because the audience already brings decades of context with them. Their presence naturally slows the film down in a good way, allowing quieter, more character-focused scenes to breathe in between the larger set pieces. Jeff Goldblum, in particular, tends to function as the film's pressure release valve. Whenever exposition starts stacking up or the plot gets too tangled, his performance cuts through it with timing and personality that feels effortless. It helps keep the film from becoming too mechanically focused on its own story. Meanwhile, the returning Jurassic World characters operate in a more action-driven space. Chris Pratt's Owen remains centered around physical presence and survival-driven moments, while Bryce Dallas Howard's Claire is often placed in situations that highlight tension and urgency. Their arcs don't necessarily reinvent anything at this stage, but they remain functional within the larger structure of the film. Where things get tricky is in how the movie shifts attention between these two generations. The film doesn't always settle on a consistent emotional anchor, and as a result, certain scenes feel like they're competing for focus rather than building toward a single unified rhythm. It's not a collapse of performance or character work, but more a structural challenge of trying to merge multiple narrative threads into one continuous experience. Even so, the ensemble does enough to hold the film together. Individually, the characters may feel unevenly prioritized, but collectively they keep the movie grounded in recognizable personalities, which helps maintain engagement even when the plotting becomes crowded or overextended. That difference in expectations really shapes how Dominion is received. It's not just about whether the movie works or doesn't, it's about what people wanted it to be in the first place. If someone is looking for tightly constructed storytelling with clear focus and strong narrative discipline, the film can feel frustrating. There's a lot happening, sometimes too much, and not everything gets the space it needs to fully develop. But if the focus shifts away from structure and toward experience, the movie starts to make more sense. It's built around momentum, scale, and constant movement. Set pieces come and go quickly, new environments keep appearing, and the film rarely sits still long enough to feel empty. That approach won't satisfy everyone, but it does keep the energy consistent. What ultimately holds it together is familiarity. The franchise has spent decades building a world and a set of characters that audiences recognize instantly. Even when the plotting gets messy or the pacing uneven, that recognition creates a baseline level of engagement. You understand who these people are, what the stakes roughly mean, and why the situation matters, even if the details sometimes blur together. So the final reaction to Dominion tends to split in two directions. One side sees a crowded, overstuffed blockbuster that struggles to balance its many moving parts. The other sees an entertaining, effects-driven adventure that delivers enough spectacle to justify its runtime. Both readings come from the same film, just through different expectations. In the end, Dominion isn't really trying to redefine the franchise. It's trying to bring it together, old and new, humans and dinosaurs, nostalgia and expansion, and let it exist on a massive scale one more time. Whether that works depends less on what the movie is, and more on what each viewer wanted it to be. That shift in setting is one of the film's most important attempts at evolution. By taking dinosaurs out of isolated environments and placing them into the wider world, Dominion tries to refresh a formula that audiences have seen repeat for decades. It's no longer just about containment failing on an island, it's about coexistence on a global scale. That idea alone opens interesting possibilities, even if the film doesn't always explore them as deeply as it could. The concept of humans and dinosaurs sharing everyday spaces carries more thematic weight than the story consistently follows through on. Still, the change in scope does help the film feel larger, even when the narrative structure remains familiar. At the same time, familiarity is both the franchise's strength and its limitation. There's comfort in knowing the rhythm: discovery, disruption, escape, survival. But that same rhythm makes it harder for the series to surprise its audience in meaningful ways. Dominion is very aware of this tension, and you can feel it in how often it tries to escalate scale rather than reinvent structure. Where the film still finds some success is in moment-to-moment execution. Even if the broader story feels familiar, individual sequences can still land effectively, especially when they focus on immediate stakes rather than long-term plotting. Those short bursts of tension or spectacle are where the movie often feels most alive. Ultimately, the experience becomes less about narrative innovation and more about whether the film's energy and imagery are enough to carry you through the repetition. For some viewers, they are. For others, the lack of structural freshness becomes more noticeable over time. And that's really where Dominion settles, a film caught between wanting to conclude a long-running saga and wanting to reinvent it, without fully committing to either direction. At its core, Dominion ends up being a film defined less by what it changes and more by what it attempts to combine. It tries to carry forward decades of storytelling while also expanding into broader ideas about ecosystems, human interference, and global consequences. Those concepts are present, sometimes even clearly visible, but they don't always fully reshape the experience in a meaningful way. What the movie does manage is scale. There's a consistent sense that this world is bigger than before, even if the narrative tools used to explore it feel familiar. That contrast, between bigger ideas and familiar execution, is where most of the film's tension lives. And that's why it becomes difficult to reduce Dominion to a simple verdict. It isn't a straightforward success or failure. It's a film that contains both effective spectacle and structural repetition, sometimes within the same sequence. One moment it feels like it's pushing the franchise forward, and the next it feels like it's replaying something we've already seen in a different setting. In the end, the movie says as much about the franchise as it does about itself. Long-running series eventually reach a point where continuation alone isn't enough to create impact. The original magic came from discovery, from showing audiences something unfamiliar. Everything afterward has been shaped by the challenge of trying to recreate that feeling in new forms. Dominion doesn't fully solve that challenge, but it does highlight it clearly. And maybe that's its most honest quality. It shows a franchise still capable of spectacle, still capable of momentum, but also still searching for a way to feel truly new again. At the same time, the film's weaknesses are hard to overlook. It often feels overloaded with plot threads, as if it's trying to service too many ideas at once. Some concepts are introduced with real potential but don't get the depth they need to fully land, and the pacing occasionally suffers under that weight. Still, it would be unfair to reduce Dominion to just its shortcomings. There are genuine moments of entertainment throughout, well-staged action, striking visuals, bursts of tension, and performances that keep the story grounded even when the structure becomes messy. And, of course, the dinosaurs remain the central appeal, delivering the kind of spectacle the franchise has always been built on. That mix of strengths and weaknesses is exactly why reactions to the film are so divided. For some viewers, the entertainment value outweighs the narrative issues. For others, the lack of focus makes it harder to fully invest. Dominion ends up existing in that in-between space where it is neither a complete failure nor a fully satisfying conclusion. Looking at the franchise as a whole, the film feels less like a definitive ending and more like a turning point. It reinforces that there is still interest in this world and that its core elements, dinosaurs, scale, and spectacle, remain effective. But it also highlights a growing challenge: how to keep that sense of discovery alive after so many iterations of the same core idea. Ultimately, Dominion leaves behind something complicated rather than conclusive. It reminds audiences of why the series became iconic in the first place, while also showing how difficult it is to recapture that original sense of wonder indefinitely. And perhaps that lingering discussion, still debating, still analyzing, still comparing, is itself proof that the franchise hasn't lost its relevance.